This year's Australian federal election turned out to be one of the biggest upsets in recent history, with incumbent Scott Morrison's Conservative Liberal Party staying in power. No one expected this. Sportsbet paid out $1.3 million to those who had bet on a Labor Party win days before the election results came in. Even Bert the Psychic Crocodile chose Labor as the winner. Many say the Labor Party's proposed climate policy, which was ambitious and something they couldn't put a cost on, played a significant part in their defeat, with Australians feeling the heat, literally. From record-breaking temperatures and droughts, there's ever more support for climate action.
It was not a climate change election. We talked about it as if it was, certainly previously. What happened with the Labor policies was there was a large focus on them by the coalition, saying these aren't going to work, there's a problem with these policies. What we need to do is to stop these policies. So the Labor Party then didn't focus on actually selling them, but actually defending them, and certainly not attacking the government's lack of action on a whole range of areas. That doubt that was being cast in a particular way around people's own insecurities, around their material conditions. Will I have a job? Will the domestic economy be maintained? Will the Chinese economy still operate? Will they keep buying our iron ore and our coal? And 70% of Australians said, climate change is really important. They picked it as one of the top issues. We know it's a problem. We know we've got to do something about it. But I don't have to do something about it tomorrow. But I worry about whether I'll have a job tomorrow. So people react much more to those immediate problems than they do to slightly longer term problems.
One of the primary points of attack the Labor Party weathered from the Liberal Party was how much their climate policy was going to cost. They couldn't put a number on it. So what happened there?
The whole question of climate policy about, how much will it cost is like, how long's a piece of string? Particularly when you're dealing with hypothetical numbers around, will the cost to the economy be in lost production or non-realised production? Certainly the Labor Party tried to play a material game and just including the environment. And were able to be attacked on that and saying, your material game here isn't playing out. We've got no costs. You haven't provided the just transition mechanisms or the transition mechanisms. You haven't provided anything for the people. So that's what creates the problem there. You need to make it a condition of those material bases about the environment so people connect the two directly. And so there's no disconnect. If we consider that a house is a human right, what else is a human right? We put human rights as the major issue. That's certainly one way I know environment campaigners have looked at in developing nations and saying the environment is about human rights. We actually need to have a good environment to have all those other human rights. Therefore, we will actually go, let's focus on human rights, but actually it's about the environment.
If we look back into history, we'll actually see that addressing climate change, especially through emissions reduction, might not be so simple, especially for the politicians leading the change. For more than a decade, a workable, credible climate policy has seemed to be the catalyst in leading each Prime Minister on both sides of politics to their downfall. Former Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was deposed just last year for proposing further emissions regulation, just as former Labor Prime Minister Julia Gillard lost her leadership due to the unpopularity of her carbon tax. Somehow, leaders and their parties just keep on ending up casualties of their climate policies. How far back does this go? What's behind the inertia to enact real, effective climate policies?
Australia has always had a very high per capita carbon footprint as long as we've been caring about climate change. And that primarily comes from the fact that Australia burns a lot of brown coal and black coal to get its electricity. The other factor that doesn't get mentioned all the time, but sometimes, is that Australia is the world's #1 exporter of coal since 1984. Australia has enormous renewable energy potential, huge amounts of sun, huge amounts of space, and a advanced industrial base and scientific base where by now, if we'd taken climate change seriously from the 1980s onwards, we would be a major player in renewable energy technologies and energy storage. There's a very long history of opposition to even carbon pricing. You have to look back to the late 1980s, and in 1989, the Science Minister of the day, Barry Jones, mooted it as a possibility.
The idea of a carbon tax came back onto the agenda in 1990-1991, but quickly died under a Keating government in 92. It came back again in 94-95 before being defeated by opposition from industry and lobbying. In 2001, then Prime Minister Howard begrudgingly allowed a mandatory renewable energy target, which he tried to kill behind closed doors.
Most people know already about the long battles over carbon pricing from 2006 onwards, and it has claimed multiple political careers, including Kevin Rudd's, Julia Gillard's, Malcolm Turnbull's. It all sort of dates to December 1st, 2009, when Tony Abbott became leader of the Liberal Party by a single vote, became leader of the opposition, overthrew the bipartisan consensus on climate change, and since then it has been chaos and mayhem, and the possibilities of finding any sort of acceptable to everyone compromise just out the window.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The carbon tax gone. Goes also a 9% impost on the price of power.
There's now a long history of failure on climate change, and people know that if you propose something that is unacceptable to well-funded corporate interests, that will cost you. And so the lesson of the Rudd and especially of the Gillard defeats was don't go too hard. Without descending into conspiracy theory, I think you could argue that the Minerals Council of Australia is enormously influential in Australia, and there is a revolving door between it and the Liberal Party, especially, and you quite often see people traipsing through the MCA on their way to being the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister or the Treasurer and back again.
And if we look towards the future, what's in store for us? And what's in store for the planet?
I expect the coalition not to do very much about climate policy at all. So essentially leave it to the market to make those shifts. The government then doesn't have to do anything. The problem, of course, is this is long term. This will take time. There will be no mitigation and there will be no adaptation, and we'll continue to allow that carbon parts per million to rise.
I think the safest heuristic is imagine the stupidest, most short-sighted, most ecologically suicidal thing that could happen, double it, and you're getting relatively close to what will happen. I don't see how a Liberal government, or Liberal national government, will feel compelled to seriously work towards meeting Australia's Paris Agreement obligations. And whenever we talk about the Paris Agreement, we should also mention that even if that were fully implemented, which it's not going to be, we're committing the world to somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees of global warming. So the idea that Paris is sort of, if we met Paris, we'd be okay, no. And frankly, we're not going to meet Paris. I think what we'll now see is desperation, geoengineering, attacks on the right to protest. The second half of the 21st century is going to make the first half of the 20th century look like a golden age of peace, love, and understanding.
At the end of the day, Australians do care about climate change. But the nature of something like climate change is that, for most Australians, it seems like such a distant thing. What I've learned is that when a proposal sounds like it's going to cost the average Australian, it needs to be communicated and defended well. That's what cost the Labor Party on the climate front this election, adding them to the string of climate policy casualties in the last 2 decades.